Did I turn on my microphone this time? Checking the mic. Okay, cool. Hello everybody and welcome back to So Biased. It is the Costume Symposium. Pew, 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 pew. This is day 2, I think, if I release this on time. The Costume Symposium is a huge group of costubers who are releasing content as part of a virtual convention. We wanted to be able to see each other in person, but COVID gestures at everything. We're all providing content for you and activities and sew-alongs and live streams so that you can all participate in what we're doing and get to meet some new costumers like me. So my name is Melissa and I primarily make and research clothing from the 1940s. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about utility clothing. Now, utility clothing is a type of clothing that was made in the UK during World War II. Because the UK is an island, they have to get so many of their things imported. And during the war, there were convoys that were being bombed constantly. So the ability to import things was severely limited. And so their supplies were really limited and rationing took over. During World War I, they had similar types of rationing, but they didn't have any price controls. And so things like clothing spiked in price to be close to 16 times what they were at the beginning of the war. And at the same time, a lot of countries that they would normally get items from, like they got all their silk from Japan, obviously they weren't getting their silk from Japan during World War II, so silk became very hard to obtain, and it was needed for the war effort, along with nylon and metal and leather. So the government decided that in order to deal with this, they created a scheme that became known as utility clothing, and the label that they created was CC41, and it had this adorable Pac-Man logo. Obviously, Pac-Man was invented much later, but it's become known as the Pac-Man logo in later years. And this was a brand that was created, filled with all kinds of restrictions that made the clothing as efficiently as possible, using the least possible amount of waste. As part of rationing in the UK, you would be given ration books that had little coupons in them. And there were coupons for butter, for sugar, for meat, but there were also coupons for clothing. And it took a certain number of coupons to buy a skirt or a pair of shoes or a dress. And once you ran out of coupons, you couldn't buy anything else. You were done for the month or for the year, depending on how often they were distributed. And it didn't matter how much money you had. If you had, millions of dollars, you couldn't go to the store and buy something if you didn't have the coupons. It was a really effective way to control prices, and prices, especially in clothing, stayed very steady throughout the war. Now, the way the government did this was really, really brilliant. They went to clothing manufacturers and said, hey, we're controlling all the distribution of cloth. If you want to get any cloth, you have to make X percentage, which was quite high. I believe it was 60 to 75% of your output has to be utility clothing. So it has to be made within these incredible restrictions. And the restrictions were numerous. I'm going to talk about this more in another video, but just a very brief overview of some of the restrictions were: no more than 5 buttons in a dress. Buttons can't be decorative. No zippers, no elastic, no turn-ups on your pants, no double-breasted jackets, no embroidery, no lace, no braids, no unnecessary decoration, no pocket flaps, no more than 2 pockets in any garment, no more than 6 seams in a skirt, no more than 2 box pleats or 4 knife pleats in a skirt, no more than 2-inch hems, no more than 2-inch heels on shoes, and the list goes on. So manufacturers were extremely limited as to how they could make garments, and the restrictions got more and more stringent throughout the war. However, the response to this by the manufacturers was amazing, and they made some of the neatest clothing and rose to this challenge in some of the coolest ways. So for dresses, most dresses at this time were about knee length and were very A-line. Because of the fabric restrictions, you started to see a lot of really loud, busy prints in dresses. And you can see some of these here, that these are some busy, busy prints. And the reason for this is so that you didn't have to match patterns. You didn't have to match up a print down the center. You didn't have to match up sleeves. And so this economized hugely in the amount of fabric that got used per individual garment. Also, because you couldn't have a lot of decoration in dresses, people got very creative with piecing. And you can see in some of these dresses that just the use of contrasting fabrics made a really, really elegant and simple dress, a whole lot more decorative while still being within all of the guidelines. In this jacket here, you can see some of the piecing in the back is really creative and adds a really beautiful shape to the back without using extra fabric. In addition to this, there was a lot of women's suits, and women's suits were very common because you saw a lot more women in the workplace, particularly in World War II, because women were needed for the war effort. And so there were all sorts of jackets, as well as these really pretty skirts that would go along with it. There was a lot of restrictions in the use of buttons. So the way people got around that is by spacing them out. So you'd have 2 buttons together and then a big space, and then another 2 buttons together and a big space. Or they would use larger buttons spaced much wider and further apart than they normally would be. Because you couldn't use zippers either, there was a lot of wrap dresses and tie dresses. Because of the rationing on metal, zippers were really hard to obtain, and so people had to get creative about the way that they closed them up. You also see a lot of belt closures to hold these dresses closed, and a lot of belts were made out of fabric or whatever material you could get your hands on because of the war. One of the more interesting things I have seen for utility clothing is evening dresses. And there are extant utility evening gowns, which are just beautiful. The restrictions on utility clothing for evening wear was a separate category. So you could still have a floor length dress if you needed it, but these were not as common and weren't purchased as much. I mean, A, because who buys that much evening wear compared to day wear anyway, but also if you only have 40 coupons a year and a dress costs you 14 coupons, you're probably not going to spend that on an evening dress you're only going to wear once or twice. But there are these really beautiful evening dresses, including wedding dresses. There are CC41 labeled utility wedding gowns. And this was something that the government promoted, saying, see, utility stuff is really quite beautiful. Fun story, the utility scheme was still going up to 1949. So when Princess Elizabeth, who is now Queen Elizabeth, got married, the clothing rationing was still in place, and she had to save her coupons to buy her wedding gown. And people found out about this and they started mailing her coupons. They're like, oh my goodness, this princess has to be able to buy a wedding dress. And they had the money, obviously, but didn't have the coupons. So they had to wait to save up their coupons. So people started mailing them their coupons. And the palace very diligently mailed every single one of them back because coupons could not be bought, sold, or transferred. At first, when the utility clothing scheme came out, people were very hesitant to buy anything. And so the government hired famous designers at the time, including Norman Hartnell, who became the designer to the Queen, had them design dresses that fit within the utility scheme and all of the restrictions. So people really liked that and started being able to say, oh, I own this designer dress that was designed by whoever the big designer was. In addition to this, they also made utility shoes. Now, in the 1940s, so many people were working for the war effort and working in general in the UK, but also in a lot of places around the world that were fighting in World War II. They needed women to go to work, and they were working in factories, on farms, in some fairly high, intense labor jobs. And so a lot of the shoes produced during this period were flats and very robust, tough, practical, heavy-duty shoes. However, they did also make heels and dress shoes. This is one of the first time you see open-toed shoes because it actually saves on fabric. There was a limit in utility shoes for women's heels. You could only have a 2 1/4 inch heel at the absolute maximum. So anybody who is making replica 1940 shoes and is making them with 4-inch heels is a fat liar. Not to mention, no one's going to go to work in a factory in 2-inch heels, make flats. People wore flats. During this time as well, women still wore stockings pretty much every day, but stockings became really, really hard to get a hold of. Most stockings in the UK were silk, and obviously silk was heavily, heavily rationed, and nylons had only been invented a few years prior to the war, and they were made by DuPont in the US, and again had to be shipped in. And nylon was also rationed, so stockings became incredibly hard to obtain. There were utility stockings made under the CC41 scheme, and women by and large hated them, not to mention because you had to still use coupons to buy a pair of stockings, as soon as they got a run in them, you had to toss them and buy new ones. So a lot of women were like, it's not worth the coupons to buy stockings. And so, necessity being the mother of invention, women came up with some of the most clever ways to make it look like they wore stockings. By and large, they dyed their legs and then drew a line up the back of their leg to look like the stocking seam. My grandmother actually lived in London during the Blitz. She was 16 when war broke out, and talked about how she and her friends would get together about once a week. They would fill up a bath with about 10 inches of water and then put tea in it. And then they would just kneel in the bathtub with their legs underwater until their legs took up the dye. And then they would take turns drawing the line on each other's legs with either a pencil or a marker or whatever they had. She said you had to have friends over to do this, otherwise you would never get the line straight. So they would have parties at each other's houses to do this, which I think is amazing. However, the manufacturers got wind of this and they started making kits of leg dyeing kits to dye your own legs. I find this endlessly amusing. In addition to all of this stuff, they also had, are you ready for this? Utility lingerie. I swear. They had everything from nighties to corsets to bras, underwear, tap pants, which were kind of the underwear of the time. And they even had really beautiful, like sexy lingerie, which there is something that makes me laugh incredibly hard about government regulated sexy lingerie. And if you have a look at some of these examples, you can just see how many beautiful options there really were. Lingerie is one of the only places that the use of elastic was allowed. One of my favorite extant examples is Patricia Mountbatten, who was the daughter of the then Lord Mountbatten, had a boyfriend who was in the RAF, the Air Force. And what the Air Force would do is they would print escape maps on silk. So say you had to eject from your plane and you were over top of northern France or Belgium or Holland or wherever it was, you would have in your kit a map of the area you were flying over printed on silk. It was printed on silk, so that it would be lightweight, it was easy to conceal, it wouldn't be destroyed by water or wind. And they were also given to POWs. They were escape maps, so they would be snuck inside other things, and so that you could just like sew them into a lining of a jacket and have your own map to be able to get out. Now, Patricia Mountbatten got him to give her his old silk map, and she had a pair of lingerie made out of it. A pair of tap pants for underwear and a bra, and she had her dressmaker make it with buttons so that she didn't have to spend coupons to get the elastic. And that tickles me. It is a museum piece now, and here it is. It is the most wonderful thing. And what Katie did, who is a retro vintage lingerie maker, makes a replica silk escape map set of lingerie. And I will link that in the description because it is everything. In addition to lingerie, they made pajamas. One really interesting thing happened in the 1940s is there happened a really quick switch from nighties and night dresses to two-piece pajamas. And the reason for this was so many people were evacuating for bombings during the Blitz. They had to go out into the streets. They had to go into a shelter. A lot of the underground tube stations were used as bomb shelters. And so when women were evacuating, they didn't want to be in a dress. They wanted to have the pants because it was a little more modest and a lot warmer, especially if you were evacuating in winter. As for men's clothing faced a lot of the same restrictions. Men were still by and large wearing suits for the majority of their work. Even if you were working outside, you would be in a button-up shirt and pants. And one of the switches that started happening at this time was from double-breasted to single-breasted suits. Before the war, most men would wear a vest or a waistcoat underneath their suits, but a vest cost extra coupons, and so it didn't really make sense to buy them. And so a lot of men switched to using sweaters, or the British call them jumpers, underneath the suit because those could be knitted and they were a lot easier to obtain and didn't cost as many coupons. One of the other things they changed about men's clothing is you couldn't have turn-ups on your pants. And what that is just at the bottom of the cuff, you would turn up and sew around so you'd have that extra little bit of fabric. And they said, no, you can't have those. That's not allowed. And the men lost their minds. I am not kidding. This became one of the biggest controversies of the entire utility scheme. There was even political comics made about how people were trying to get exemptions from the turn-ups law because they wanted to have turn-ups on their pants. Sounding familiar to anybody? In addition to all this, there was a huge campaign called the Make, Do, and Mend campaign, where instead of buying new things, people were encouraged to repair or repurpose or mend whatever they had available. And to that end, the government also released patterns that could be laid onto existing garments of how to make a bodice out of a sleeve and how to make a dress out of an old suit. And because you didn't have to pay for the fabric because you already had it, this didn't cost you any coupons. So you could get a new garment, or essentially a new garment, without having to use up these coupons in order to buy something. Now, these are all pretty practical pieces of clothing, and the manufacturers managed to do some really nice things to make them very, very stylish. But there are some hilarious examples of things that happened in the utility scheme for real during World War II. Now, number one is the utility furs. Yes, this is real, I swear. Fur coats, fur gloves, fur everything was still considered to be a necessity, and so they found ways of using domestic animals in the UK that weren't imported, and sheepskin and rabbit and a few others, to have a utility fur scheme. As well as that is, it was hard to obtain leather, but there were some fake leather shoes out there, and it did not stop the manufacturers from trying to make things fancy. And one of my favorite finds is this. It is utility fake stamped snakeskin pumps. There's a war on, but I need me some snakeskin pumps. And then, hands down, my favorite, this is also a real piece. This is actually a museum piece at the Imperial War Museum in London. The gas mask purse. During the war, the Britons were absolutely positive they were going to be invaded. And because of all of the gas attacks that happened in World War I, they were like, this is going to happen. It happened in World War I. The Germans are going to invade, and we're going to be bombed by gas. And they distributed gas masks amongst a lot of the populace, particularly in the larger cities. And they invented this, the gas mask purse. So what it is a compartment on the bottom that is cylindrical. You just pop the end off, pull the gas mask out, and it has the canister as well as a small face piece to just put over your face. And the top portion of the purse is still completely functional. So the utility scheme kept going until 1949. In 1949, the scheme was eliminated entirely, and you could just go buy whatever you want. It did work incredibly well, though. The estimates on how much fabric they saved and how much they were able to economize were staggering. It was millions of yards of fabric and thread, and was able to divert a huge amount of materials to the war effort, as well as keeping the costs really low, because there was none of the hyperinflation in the UK for clothing that there was elsewhere, as well as the way that they had it in World War I. The majority of the examples that I've pictured here, I found on Etsy. These are all available for sale. They still exist. Some of these are museum pieces, and I will link to those below. I will link to any of the sources I used, as well as all of the books that I've used for my research in this, and I hope you will check them out. Now it comes the time for the badges. If you are a badge collector, I will leave a link in the description below. I will also leave it here. And here is your QR code if you want to get your badge for the utility clothing video. Click on it right now, or if you want, go into the description below and click on the link there. Now, if you like this video, please like, please subscribe. Any interaction you have with the video really helps. Please let me know, what was your favorite piece in this? Mine personally was the skirt with the swooped piecing in it. I think that was really beautiful. I might try to remake that myself. But please leave me a comment. Please tell me what you thought. Also, I will leave a link to the CosTube Symposium. There is so much going on there. Please see all the wonderful content that all these amazing creators have made. Please participate in some of the live streams. I'm having a live stream on disability and costuming, and I have another video coming out on the Canadian Women's Army Corps and an original museum piece uniform that I found. I hope you will stay tuned and watch that. I hope to see you around soon, but until then, stay happy and healthy, stay safe, take care of each other. See you soon. Bye. Okay, big trailer, are you done? Please don't park right in front of the house. Before the war, most men would wear a vest. It's a vest coat.